In this series, lowimpact.org and the Open Credit Network talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
So today I'm speaking with Naresh Giangrande, who's you were co-founder of Transition Totnes and the Transition Network. Is that right?
That's right. Well, yeah.
But you're moving on now. What are you going to do next?
Well, what I am doing next, I stopped working for the organization some couple of years ago, and I still do some of the trainings. I still do I just did a training in the New Forest a few weeks ago. But I'm working for Gaia Education on some of their online education programs. I did I wrote a paper on education for sustainability based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm just starting something we're calling living activism or contemplative activism, about bringing together contemplatives and contemplative lifestyles alongside activists, social activists of various descriptions, and what we can learn from each other.
And why did you leave Transition?
Well, I guess I felt that I had given all I had to give to that movement, and that it was time for new people, new energy, new ways of doing things to come in and take it, wherever it needs to go. And I think there was also, for me, there was an element of burnout that, after working in Transition for maybe, 13, 14 years, that I'd reached a point where I felt, I had this feeling of just sitting at this coalface of social change and being aware of the kind of changes, the sort of systemic changes that so far virtually every society has shied away from. Being aware of the scale of change that's needed and on one hand, and the response that we're generally making on the other, and just that feeling of, well, I don't think I can sit on that coalface much longer and be effective. And I think that's an interesting question for any activist, where, how do they sit with that? How do they sit with the incredibly painful contradictions that we all have to sit with, if you're really sitting in that place of, where we have to go to, or the sort of degree and level of change combined with what's actually happening.
Yes. So Transition has a sort of a localization, local resilience agenda, but that it hasn't really happened at a large enough scale to make a difference to the way that humanity is moving. And why do you think it didn't have as much influence as you probably would have liked to have had?
Well, I think there's several reasons for that. There's been quite a strong element of capture of governments, regulatory environments around the world by particularly by multinational corporations who most governments are enthralled to, and what the result is that they are getting subsidized, and the one that gets the headline is fossil fuel production. Fossil fuel producers are subsidized to $5.5 trillion a year. When you're facing a situation where, as a locally based alternative, maybe you don't have the skills and the abilities that multinational corporations can buy, combine that with the level of subsidies that they are receiving, and the playing field is so unlevel that it's a bit of a joke. And the fact is, I think consciously or unconsciously, most people are somewhat aware of it. Is Peter Haas created a term called Technosphere, and it's this.
What was the name? What was the name again?
Technosphere.
No, the name of the Peter.
Peter Haas. I think he's Dutch, and this sense that we are in thrall to this huge machine that we've created, this huge machine that crosses boundaries, that crosses national and political boundaries, and is we are dependent on for just about everything we need. And this idea that we're going to somehow relocalize all that feels somewhat far-fetched, particularly as long as we are wanting to use technology like you and I are using right now, and be dependent on that. If we were happy about going back to the sort of level of simplicity that we could make just about everything locally, then that's another thing. But all the signs are that there's very, very few people who are willing to make that kind of a shift as yet.
Yeah.
And whether as the current crisis deepens and develops, well, maybe there's going to be more and more people who are probably virtually forced to do it. But anyway, that's another question.
Do you think this giant machine is going to crash?
I think it is crashing. I think there's no two ways about it. However, I would put a caveat on that, which is this idea that this futurist William Goodman said was that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So there are going to be places where it's going to crash. There's going to be places where it's just going to carry on. There's going to be places that are doing sort of transition. There's places that people will be doing some sort of techno fantasy of some description. So sort of green technology or whatever. So there's going to be all that's going to be happening. It's going to be happening in parallel. It's going to be happening in different ways in different places. So there's, and I think that's already the case. For many people in the world, the collapse has already happened. It's just a question of on a recent training, on two recent trainings actually, I asked this. We do these things called constellations. We asked the question about, well, in 20 years' time, your life is going to be radically different from the way it is now, without putting any positive or negative on it. And I asked that question, asked people to place themselves at one end of the spectrum, or, yes, my life is going to be totally different. No, it's going to be more or less the same, and put themselves on a spectrum. And in both cases, everybody in the room, which is extremely unusual, everybody in the room was way at the end of, yeah, my life is going to be radically different. My life in this place, in a kind of modern Western, relatively wealthy capitalist economy. We're not talking about Mozambique, and we're not talking about Kenya. We're talking about,
Yeah, everybody I speak to, really, of all different sort of classes and all different sort of political persuasions. Really, if you push them, they say, yes, I think something bad is coming. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but
well, Dave, I wouldn't even put that on it, because I feel very mixed ideas about the sort of world that my children and my grandchildren are going to be living in say 20 years' time, and it's going to be radically different from mine. But there's also going to be radical opportunity as well as radical change. Some of it might be very uncomfortable change. Some of it might be really, really difficult to live with. I'm not at all convinced that it's going to be all bad. I think it's in the same way now. We see some amazing things, and that's been one of the great things about working in the transition movement, is that I've got to meet some of the most incredible people in all parts of the world doing amazing things with practically nothing to back them up with, and they do. And at the same time, we then see some of the horrible things that are happening in the world.
Yeah.
So,
but also community often gets stronger in times of crisis. I mean, a lot of people look back with fondness at the war, when people pulled together and sort of looked after each other.
mm.
So yeah, some things, communities might become stronger. So thinking about transition specifically, why do you think it didn't get more media coverage?
Well, I think media coverage is a particular thing, and I mean, we didn't set out to get media coverage, but it sort of came to us because we were tooting the peak oil horn, and when that kind of came and went, I think that undermined a lot of our credibility. I think we probably weren't media hungry enough, and I think a lot of the stuff that transition groups do is pretty unsexy. It's not particularly photogenic. There's, if you're really, really good at spinning a story, then as my mate Rob Hopkins is eminently great at, then you can create something that is people really resonate with, and is very strong. But that's a particular skill. So I think I think for all those reasons, it's probably we didn't stay in the limelight for as long as we might have liked. And and that's also the nature of the beast too. Media consumes things and then it moves on to the next thing.
I think it was
newsworthy thing.
It was a very good story. We need to build community cohesion and resilience because because of what's happening to the environment and what's happening to the oil supply. And it hasn't peaked because of new discoveries, but it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's going to happen. And there's also, I think, something else in it is that that's always a contradiction, that the early adopters, the people who can see where it's all going, are by nature and just by the very fact of who they are, they're way at the head. They're the head of the wave. And now we're seeing much more of a wave, with XR and such like. So it's quite hard to keep something like that, in the sort of media limelight when it's clearly there isn't that wave coming behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a contradiction, because we could see, and I think most people who are working in this kind of local resilience space can see the absolute need for that. Just today, I was in discussions with various people about, coronavirus. Like, okay, I don't think it's an existential threat to the human race, but it could cause some pretty big disruption. So, what do we do? Well, let's start talking to each other for a start. Let's start building some stocks and supplies. Let's start thinking about, well, if the brown stuff really does hit the fan, then, do we have a plan? Mm-hmm. So, and all those things are the sort of things transition has been advocating.
Mm-hmm. Was there much internal conflict within transition? And did it do much harm, do you think?
It was the most surprisingly unconflict-ridden place that I can imagine. It was extraordinarily harmonious, and we were all just kind of happy to be where we were and happy to work together. And I think the atmosphere, both in the organization and also in most transition groups, I think we're pretty good. Having said that, we often heard stories, and it was the case that some transition groups went down because of conflict, and conflict is not being able to process it, not being able to deal with it, not being able to not having the skills and the resources to do that, which is why we put a significant resource into helping people to understand that whole thing about group dynamics and how groups work, and how effective collaboration and things like that.
Because Transition isn't a top-down organization, is it? Anybody can do whatever they like within reason. And so how do you keep people on message when they don't need permission to do anything?
Well, you don't, and you just allow people to speak. I remember some of the first YouTube videos put up about transition were for some group in New Zealand who held a conference and talking about transition, and they put up a YouTube video, and we were kind of looking at that and thinking, God, who are these people? We have no idea who they are, how they found out about us, but there it was. We were really unfussed about people going off message, or as we see it, off message, and that's been a really interesting kind of inquiry, I guess, we held in transition, is, well, who has the right to speak for transition or the transition movement? Well, nobody does, really. Even somebody like myself, I mean, I wouldn't presume to speak for the transition. I could say what I felt or what I saw or what I was experiencing in Totnes or other places, but it's an interesting thing that, and often people would come to us and say, "Oh, what's transition's take on da da da," or how come you haven't put out a statement about such and such? And it's like, well, who's going to put that out, and who are they speaking for, and what authority do they have? Well, in itself, that's one of the, I think, most interesting things about transition. It's one of the I'd say it's one of the first self-organizing international movements of people in the world, and we were experimenting with that, and often in a very unconscious way. We didn't put a lot of time and energy into thinking, oh well, how do you run a self-organizing international movement? We just kind of did it.
Did you find it easy or difficult to raise money?
Well, money is one of the more difficult things for transition groups, because for a start, there is not the local markets that will support transition work, and like I said, I think there's that whole question of subsidies that go into the fossil fuel economy. And is busy propping up all sorts of unsustainable and undesirable farming practices, for instance. But there's not a lot of money for that sort of work at a local level. And I've seen local groups, particularly local energy groups, community-supported agriculture groups, other such things, raised quite substantial, quite a lot of capital for investment, because they had a product that was clearly financeable and could clearly create a return. And most people investing in that sort of thing weren't wanting to make it stock market beating returns. They just weren't wanting a reasonable return on their capital, and wanting to know that their money was doing something good in the world.
Yeah. Do you think there's much of a role for alternative currencies in the sort of transition approach? And I know the Totnes pound failed in the end, didn't it? And I wondered if you'd come across mutual credit and what we're doing at the Open Credit Network. I wonder whether you'd come across.
Yeah, I've been talking to Tony Greenham and I'm aware of what they're doing with the Southwest Bank and cooperative banking systems, and I think there's an evolution in all that. An alternative currency that is tied to the national currency, the way the Totnes pound was, and many of them are, I think is of limited value.
It appears that
if the scheme is big enough and you can get enough business to business interaction and trade, then that makes a big difference. And particularly then if you can borrow in your local currency and pay back money in your local currency and all that, that is something that would make a local currency really work, and also make it incredibly easy to use and convenient, because if you're like most people, you wave, just go into a shop and wave around a piece of plastic, and that's your money. It's kind of hard to beat.
I think the local currencies, well, and cryptocurrencies, the value of them was that they showed people that there can be alternatives.
Yeah.
Well,
it's showing up that there can be alternatives, but also showing up this the kind of fantasies or ideas that people have, or beliefs we have about what a £5 note represents, because this whole idea that it's somehow backed or somehow anything real other than a set of beliefs is, and so we would create a whole nother set of beliefs. And people went kind of wow about that for a while. I remember whenever I gave a talk and I started talking about, we started printing money in Totnes, and suddenly the whole sways of the audience who were half asleep, suddenly their ears perked up and went, really? Tell me more.
I'm surprised now about the number of people who actually know where money comes from and how banks create it. 10 years ago, very, very few people knew anything about that, but a lot of people do now.
Yeah. Which is good. That's got to be a good thing.
But I guess the convertibility of local currencies meant that, it's absolutely tied to the bank issued debt money. And that's why I find mutual credit so interesting, because it's not, you can't buy the credits with conventional money. It's separate in that way. And therefore I think there's huge potential. I don't know if you know about Sardex in Sardinia. There's a scheme in Sardinia, which is turning over 50 million euros worth of trade a year just in Sardinia. So there's huge potential, really. I'd like to talk to transition groups more about that.
I believe there is, and I know that in places like Argentina, when the national currency became virtually unusable, that's when local currencies came into their own.
Do you know, would you have any idea of the best way to approach transition groups or the transition network as a whole about mutual credit, and how maybe they could promote and maybe use mutual credit in their local groups?
It's not my area of expertise. So I really, rather than kind of speculate, I think I'll just leave that one.
Yeah. Okay. What are your ideas about relocalization now? How, the best way to finance relocalization or to engage with local and national politicians, maybe? What do you think are the most important things to focus on? And do you think governments will be responsive at all? Or do you think they're too much under the sway of corporations?
It always surprised me how much interest national politicians took of the transition movement. I was constantly amazed, and at the same time, I think they are so caught up in that whole that mega system that I think it's very difficult to imagine sort of local economics. But we've had interest from and involvement from everybody from Gordon Brown to Theresa May, and many local politicians. But you know, there was a lot of interest from national politicians. I don't think they could do very much about it, or do very much to help us. I mean, Theresa May was part of the group. Before she was Home Secretary and before she was Prime Minister, she was part of the group who, in her local constituency, which was Maidenhead, she was one of the groups that started Transition Maidenhead. But she didn't last in that role very long.
So yeah, I know there's government legislation and sort of government action as regards localization. I mean, the people I've spoken with and the people I've interviewed for this series, they've always found it a hindrance rather than a help. So the community energy schemes, then they would have to buy a license, which was the same sort of license that E.ON would buy, too expensive for a local community energy scheme. So they have to sell their electricity to the national grid for 4p a unit, and local members have to buy it back for 18p a unit, which is sort of really stymies them. And there are only subsidies for large farmers, I think over 10 hectares, which is really difficult for the local community supported agriculture schemes. And allowing corporations to avoid paying tax, you know, whereas they clamp down completely on small businesses.
Yeah.
So I just don't see a way to.
There was a I can't remember the name of the town, but there was a town in, I think it was Wales, who started to set up the sorts of tax avoidance mechanisms as a town. There was like 40 or 50 local businesses got together and said, okay, well, we're going to create what it's called a Dutch sandwich or something like that. Let's create one of those because that's the people we are having to compete against. The Costa Coffees, the Amazons, that's what they use. So let's use it. I can't remember the name of the town. I can't remember what happened because of it. But again, you know, we get back to the same, the same thing about there's not a level playing field.
It will be good. Whatever the next big movement is, whether it's XR or something that follows from XR, and also within the mutual credit world, we're trying to take it global, something called the credit commons, so that mutual credit schemes all over the world can trade with each other. And so we really want to affect the sort of the global trading system. Whatever the next big movement is, what do you think they could learn from transition?
I think first of all is to trust that there are loads of people out there who will respond and who will come along with you, who will do things that are, you know, incredible, and just trust that that's going to happen. And so trust people. I think enabling learning is a really important piece, and you know, we did a certain amount of that, and I think we could have done more and we could have done better, but enabling that kind of peer-to-peer learning to take place and to work. Certainly a lot of people, a lot of transition groups did some really good cut and paste sort of jobs, you know, saw something happening somewhere and they thought, okay, I'll just take that and get it to happen here. And it did. And in many cases you could just cut and paste and voila.
What sort of things?
Well, the things are like local energy cooperatives and the whole slew of kind of food projects, everything from land share and to community supported agriculture to vegetable box schemes, all those sorts of things.
I think that's very important, so that each community doesn't have to reinvent the wheel if it's been done and it's successful.
That's right. You know, and local currencies. You know, there are many local currencies happened. And you know, there are certain areas, certain things that became really hot and became. I mean, I've heard food described as the sort of gateway drug of transition. You know, it's what got a lot of people into it, because everybody eats and everybody's interested in food. And then, you know, and then there's this whole social exclusion, epidemic of loneliness and unhappiness in our society. You know, that things like maker cafes and maker spaces helps to enable, you know, all those places where transition, you know, those kind of cracks, and those places are where transition groups have really thrived. It's just the question of how, you know, I think paying attention then, if you were talking about, well, what are the lessons? So paying attention to, well, how do we make that step from being these people who are finding the cracks and are living within the cracks of society,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we make that next step
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, to the mainstream? I was just at a conference. Well, it was a trade show last week in London, called Future Build, and I, you know, when I look at some of their material, you know, like that, you know, they're talking about this, you know, they're using this sort of language. This is mainstream. This is not a bunch of hippies talking about mud bricks and hemp plaster, although there was some of that.
Just want to say for the podcast, that says responding to the emergency.
Yeah. And there were, you know, the keynote speech was given by this guy from XR. So it is part of it, you know, this is entering the mainstream really quickly, and in a way that the mainstream building industry in this instance has just unable to respond to the emergency, because A, they don't even know what it is, and B, just, you know, their whole product line, everything about it is so unsustainable and unregenerative and unable to respond to the emergency that it's almost laughable, if it wasn't so sad. But you know, we are going to see more of that, I think, and as people become more and more aware, and then it's going to be, how do you create the rhetoric that gets beyond the early adopters, that gets beyond the cultural creators. Mm-hmm. So it's those kind of questions, and I know groups like XR are asking those sort of questions, which is great. And I think with kind of crowdsourcing those sorts of questions with those sorts of responses is the way that it's going to be, you know, the way that those steps are going to be taken.